One night, as I was falling asleep, I heard a rustling noise outside our bedroom window. As I lay there, a dozen voices suddenly shouted in unison, "We hate your books!" It was fairly loud, and I looked over at Tammy, but she was asleep. Then they repeated the phrase. I jumped up and looked out the window, but no one was there. The voices were high-pitched and certainly not mortal. I knew I'd been visited by evil spirits. Hello, and welcome back to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and tonight we're discussing the second half of Chad Daybell's autobiography, Living on the Edge of Heaven. If you haven't, please watch my video on the first half of Chad's autobiography before jumping into this one, otherwise you might not get the full picture. Let's remember what we learned in the first video. We learned that Chad developed a fear of death at a young age, and that his failure to become a child athletic celebrity left him bitter and friendless. Most importantly, we learned the vital part that fantasy plays in Chad's life. Whenever he feels bad about himself, or he's bored, or he's lonely, or he feels like he's not enough, he resorts to his fantasies about being a visionary prophet and having a magnificent destiny. When we left off, Chad had just returned from his 2-year mission in New Jersey, during which he was told that he would marry a beautiful blonde. A week later, I was home in Springville and saw my brother Paul's 1988 high school yearbook on his shelf. I flipped through it and saw a half-page feature with photos about a girl named Tammy Douglas. When I saw her face, I felt the most electrifying shock of my life. Staring back at me was a beautiful girl with short blonde hair. On the opposite page is a stunning photo of Tammy. I'm not sure if she was lightening her hair or if this picture is just strangely lit, but she really does appear to have been blonde. It turns out that she and Chad went to high school together, but she was 2 years behind him and he never noticed her. For reasons unknown, Chad feels like he has to justify not having dated her then. I came to understand that some sort of spiritual veil had been placed over my mind concerning her during high school. If we had gotten to know each other at that time, we would have become inseparable. However, we still had many growing experiences to go through on our own before we became a couple. So romantic. So romantic. So romantic, in fact, that Chad repeated the line to his next soulmate, Lori. This is from the James and Elena story, or as I call it, Loinfire. On the off chance you're watching this video from an alternate dimension and don't know what this is, Chad wrote a fictionalized version of his relationship with Lori Vallow, which he texted her. I must clarify that James is a very difficult person to get information from. He has been blessed with great knowledge, but 99% of the people he knows do not realize that. He is very guarded, and it is a great task to gain his trust. But as Elena leaned toward him and asked a couple of very insightful questions, his heart burst with joy. He knew she was one of the very few people on earth he could trust. James' spirit was so excited at this revelation that he shattered a thick veil that had been placed between these two souls during their mortal lives. The thick veil had been placed because of the unique, unparalleled love James and Elena had shared in previous lifetimes. That veil had prevented them from finding each other until this appointed day that would be remembered throughout the heavens as the true beginning of a spectacular mission that would save millions of souls and defeat the forces of darkness. I swear nothing is sacred to this bozo. How many people did he say this to? Did he say it to Julie Rowe? He's barely introduced this idea of a thick, amnesia-inducing veil before he contradicts it by saying Tammy had always had a crush on him. She admired me from afar in the school halls. While I was on my mission, she had even told her friends, "I'm going to date Chad Daybell when he gets home." I'm sure he included this in order to stroke his own ego, but why would God have placed a veil in his mind so that he wouldn't notice her, but not done the same for Tammy? Imagine this. She feels an undeniable attraction to him, an indescribable cosmic longing, the stirrings of a love that will change the very universe. And he is neurologically and spiritually incapable of knowing she exists. It's like Chad's version of God was setting them up for a really weird stalking situation. Honestly, I'm not even sure I believe Chad about seeing her photo in his brother's yearbook. He says that afterward he went to several singles ward events in the hopes of meeting her. But if he really saw her photo and knew she was the one, why didn't he just call her? She lived next door to his best friend Les, so couldn't Chad have asked him to set them up? I just find it a little sus that he was so certain about her, but didn't take any decisive action to get to know her. Instead, he attended the same single ward events he likely would have attended anyway, and at one of them, they played volleyball together. She was on one volleyball team, so I joined the other team, and soon we rotated to be across the net from each other. We stared at each other for a moment before she confidently said, "I'm going to spike it in your face." I smiled at her comment, but the only reply I could come up with was, "Oh yeah?" Chad doesn't say if she actually spiked the ball in his face. I hope that means she did. Chad is strangely quiet about their first date, though. We were both a little nervous, but I was smitten right from the start. The date went great, and we went to a fireside together at the Marriott Center 2 days later. He never says what he liked about her. He never really describes her as a person. I'm not sure he saw her as a person. Chad decided that he wanted to teach at the Missionary Training Center, so he filled out an application and taught a sample session. Somehow I forgot to read this earlier, so I'm going to read it now. An evaluator observed me, and afterward he said he was impressed. He said I should expect a call to start working there within a week. I was excited that everything had gone so smoothly. But when he checked back a week later, the MTC had lost his entire application, including the students' evaluations of his teaching, and they said he'd have to do it all over again. He told his new girlfriend, Tammy, who happened to be the local cemetery secretary, and she got him a job digging graves instead. In retrospect, I know there was some heavenly intervention involved in my missing MTC file, because the cemetery job was actually a better fit for me in every way. I could work longer hours at a higher hourly wage, and I could see Tammy much more often. This is the kind of story that you might not think deeply about if you were reading this book casually, but I've never read a Chad Daybell book casually, and something about this story stinks. The first question that comes to my mind is, why would Chad bother recounting this story about the MTC job in his autobiography? He spends more than a page talking about a job he didn't get, and then writes an unrealistically effusive paragraph about how great his job digging graves is. I don't think the MTC lost his application. I think they rejected him, and he mentally convinced himself that it was divine providence that got him the cemetery job, because that's what he resorts to when his ego is threatened. Then, when he sat down to write this book, he wanted to include the story as an example of the Spirit's influence in his life, but he didn't want to admit he'd been turned down for a job, so he massaged the story a little. Otherwise, why not just skip the MTC job and start the section with, "Tammy got me a job digging graves"? Because both of them worked for the cemetery system, they often had excuses to see each other at work. I began praying sincerely whether Tammy was the person I should marry. One evening, I was driving home over Ironton Hill after classes at BYU. I began to pray, telling Heavenly Father that even though I'd only known Tammy for about 10 weeks, I had decided to propose to her. I received such a strong, "Yes!" response that it brought tears to my eyes. After so many no answers over the years, I had finally received my yes. He frames this as having gotten told no by the Spirit, but I think it was really by women. The description of the yes he got from Tammy herself is somewhat less exciting. On the night before Thanksgiving, I knelt down before her and gave her a diamond engagement ring. She thankfully said yes, and we spent Thanksgiving Day showing the ring to our extended families. Does it sound like he was thankful that she said yes, or that she was thankful he asked her? Because I think Chad makes it sound like the latter, when it was probably the former. He and Tammy got married in the Manti Temple. Chad says they enjoyed being newlyweds, which I assume means they enjoyed one particular aspect of being newlyweds. Then he devotes another page to discussing times he and Tammy had crossed paths during high school, all of which he claims God wiped from his mind in order to keep them apart. Obviously, Chad did know who she was. He says a bit about Tammy's mother and grandmother, which is surprising given that he didn't even talk about his own mother. He claims that Tammy's mother had her own near-death experience early in life. He ends the chapter with his and Tammy's engagement photo, which they took in a cemetery. Thus ends chapter 11. Chapter 12, wrapping up at BYU. The Missionary Training Center wasn't the only place where Chad applied to become a religious teacher. During his junior year of college, he again applied to teach religious classes, this time through the seminary school, which, if I understand correctly, is religious education for high school students. And gosh darn it, wouldn't you know, fate conspired against him again. This time it took the form of a supervisor who sabotaged Chad's students' teaching in just the strangest way possible. For the opening hymn each day, he would put a cassette tape into a boombox and play space-age synthesizer versions of the hymns, rather than have a student play the piano. Apparently, Chad had to conduct the students while they sang along with the tape. On the second day of teaching, Chad lost track of the beat, and the supervisor grabbed his arm and corrected his tempo while shouting, "Do it like this, not like Brother Daybell was doing it!" He continued to guide my arm until the end of the song. I felt the students' respect for me slip away, and my self-esteem dropped through the floor. This is what happens when Chad tries to make things up. Suddenly, we're all plunged into an alternate universe where deranged seminary teachers publicly humiliate you for not being able to conduct hymns arranged for the synthesizer by Ross Geller. What really happened? I seriously doubt Chad was turned down because he didn't know how to conduct hymns. By the time he was rejected from the program, he'd already decided it wasn't for him. The letter included evaluations from the students in my class, and I was relieved to see they were overwhelmingly positive. But as the door closed on one career opportunity, thankfully another one opened. See, it wasn't that he was a terrible teacher with no sense of rhythm and a voice that could put the most chronic of insomniacs to sleep in 4 minutes flat. It's just that the universe had something better in store for him. This time, it's journalism. He lists various part-time newspaper jobs that he did, casually drops in that he was disappointed when Tammy told him she was ready to have a baby, and then goes on some more about the articles he wrote for the student paper. Chad managed to graduate with a journalism degree a month before baby Garth was born. What Chad never says outright in these 2 chapters is that by the time he finished college, he already very much wanted to be seen as a religious authority with wisdom to share. He was rejected from those types of positions twice, for reasons we don't really know, because he told us these surreal stories instead. And this raises the question, why was he really rejected? Was it because he was off-putting and dull? That seems entirely possible. I mean, there's a reason everybody listens to that speech he gave the day he met Lori on 1.5 speed. I'm also curious if there was an issue with what he was teaching, because Chad didn't actually want to be a teacher. He wanted to be a prophet, and prophets have revelations. Was Chad teaching from the book or from his own personal doctrine? I keep thinking back to that story about how he got so worked up over a poem about Jesus while he was at the Missionary Training Center that class had to be adjourned. For all his talk of humility, Chad's never been afraid to seek attention. I believe it's possible that he went off message and introduced some of his own insights during his student teaching, and the evaluators said, "This guy doesn't know how to stay on brand." If so, they were right. This chapter's closing photograph shows Chad with an enormous pompadour. Thus ends chapter 12. Chapter 13, the move to Ogden. Chad and Tammy moved to Ogden, Utah, where Chad was hired as a copy editor for the Ogden Standard Examiner. He describes his job duties with a lot of unnecessary detail, explains how his boss became a paraplegic after falling off his roof, and then claims to have used his psychic abilities to track down Tammy's ancestors so they could get their temple work done. Thus ends chapter 13. Chapter 14, my second near-death experience. Before I get into the meat of this chapter, I want to point out that while Chad was with the Standard Examiner, The paper published an interview with Betty Eady, I think it's pronounced Eady, author of the best-selling NDE memoir, Embraced by the Light. I read the book. I didn't enjoy it. I thought it was dull and full of toxic positivity, and I found it off-putting that she coded it for Mormons but never admitted she was Mormon. That felt disingenuous to me. But my point is that Betty Eady was incredibly successful, especially in Utah, and Chad definitely would have noticed her success. That's going to come into play later. Chad claims that his own NDE, his second NDE, occurred during a family vacation to La Jolla Cove in California. He had climbed out on a rocky outcropping when a freak monster wave came down on him. This time he found himself in a tunnel of light with none other than Grandpa Keith and Finity Daybell. Keith was speaking to me and gesturing with his hands. He mentioned my children and described the roles they would play in the future. He also explained the tasks I needed to accomplish. Finity didn't speak, but he watched me intently. Finally, Keith asked if I would be willing to fulfill the assignments he had outlined, and I agreed to do so. Then he made a motion with his hand, and I was suddenly back in my body, which had washed closer to shore. Note the total lack of emotion and detail in this account. I've read a lot of NDE memoirs now. This ain't one of them. Chad went to the hospital and got stitches for his cuts. He even includes a photograph of himself afterward to prove it. But all the photo makes clear is that his injuries were nowhere near life-threatening. Also, he didn't mention his miraculous experience to any of his family members. But before you can say he didn't really have an NDE, he jumps in to explain. Unlike other near-death experiences, I wasn't taken to a glorious city or given a tour of the spirit world. It was more like an urgent business meeting where Grandpa Keith poured information into me during the minute or so I was out of my body. So he says that, but then he admits he couldn't remember anything he and Grandpa Keith had talked about. There was also a long-term effect from the incident. My personal veil had been ripped open even wider, and this time it didn't close up nearly as much as it had after my Flaming Gorge experience. I could remember Keith speaking with me, but the actual conversation about my future tasks was removed from my mind. I just knew it had to do with the future earthly missions of my children, 4 of whom hadn't been born yet. I started having déjà vu experiences, along with waking visions of future events happening in certain locations. I also began having direct intervention in my life from the other side. Wasn't he already experiencing direct intervention from the other side? He already had all of these promptings. God was already letting him know whom to marry and which career path to take. Those incidents, which came before the second NDE, don't seem any different from the ones that came after. In the next scene, Chad began to fill out an application for a master's program, and then the spirit told him that was the wrong choice, and he threw the application in the garbage. The interesting thing is that although I was the most studious of my brothers, they all now have advanced degrees, and I don't. No, he's not jealous of his brothers at all. He claims to have had a vision of Emma while Tammy was pregnant with her. As I was praying, I felt a magnificent presence next to me. I looked up and saw a beautiful woman with shoulder-length dark hair standing a few inches off the ground, and she had placed her right hand on my back. I knew instinctively that this was Emma, the daughter whose physical body was currently developing inside Tammy. A comforting feeling passed through me, and she assured me everything would work out. Then she was gone, but a great feeling of love passed over me, and I knew that she was a special girl who would bless many lives. Anyone who still thinks Emma isn't his favorite? Compare and contrast his vision of her with the description of Garth that comes immediately after. The visit from Emma was comforting to us, but the thought of another child was somewhat daunting. Despite Tammy's best efforts, Garth was turning into a wild child. He would get into the kitchen cupboards and dump everything out, particularly syrup. He was also a master climber. If he saw Tammy put cookies in the cupboard above the fridge, he'd find a way to get them when she wasn't looking. He was too cunning for a 1-year-old, and it was getting very frustrating. I don't understand how someone with 4 younger siblings can be this clueless about what children are like. All children want to pull things out of cupboards and dump them on the floor. That's not a sign of insufficient parenting. It's actually the opposite. It's a sign that a child is engaged and curious and feels secure enough in their environment that they want to explore. Me, I did the same thing, only I like to dump out flour. I'm sure that to a toddler, syrup is a fascinating substance. That doesn't mean the kid is a wild child. And how about Chad blaming Garth's upbringing entirely on Tammy, as if Chad had nothing to do with the parenting of this kid? I'll quote Dr. Phil here. The most important role model in a child's life is a same-sex parent. That's true whether Chad likes it or not. As I've pointed out regarding many of Chad's books, he has inappropriate expectations of children. And sadly, here we see that he applied those ridiculous ideas to his own children. There isn't a 1-year-old on the planet who can accurately be described as cunning. That is not something of which a toddler is capable. A child wanting to eat cookies doesn't indicate that he's an evil mastermind. I know we're all still irritated with Garth for his performance at the trial, but rereading this made me feel genuinely bad for him. He never had a chance to win his father's love and approval, no matter what he did or how much loyalty he evinced. It's especially sad in light of this sweet picture of Tammy and Garth, where Tammy just looks so happy and obviously adores her baby. I don't know what this picture of her and Chad underneath is. I'm not sure if they're dressed as piglets or goats, maybe? It's peculiar. Anyway, Chad says he continued to pray about his family. Frankly, he implies that it was because of Garth that he was praying, and that he had a vision of his 5 children, right down to their hair color. Of course, that's easy to claim 20 years after your youngest child was born. Throughout this chapter, there are hints that Chad was a terrible husband and father. Not just the bit with Garth. He also moved his family into a mobile home that he'd failed to realize didn't have a shower. He got Tammy pregnant again when Emma was only 9 months old, and then he failed to supervise Emma while she was in the yard, and she fell and sustained a forehead cut that required stitches. This cut was apparently the inspiration for Emma's head injuries lead to time travel plot device. Thus ends chapter 14. Chapter 15, A Return to the Cemetery. Writing for the newspaper was making Chad fat, according to him, so he took a job as the Springville cemetery sexton. He tells several stories of the sort that would eventually fill his painfully unfunny book, 1 Foot in the Grave, which I will cover in a future video. His humor style varies between folksy and corny with a dash of Ellen-style, aw shucks. It's not good. Anyway, the major impression I have from this section is that whether or not these Travel Channel ghost encounters happened, Chad was creeped out by the cemetery. There was an actual mood change in the cemetery once the sun set. I wouldn't necessarily call it sinister, but certainly it was more frightening and tense. Despite all the time I spent in the cemetery, if I had to go out there at night, I was definitely on edge. Every sound made me jump. He and Tammy decided to have a 4th child. Leah was born a month early via emergency C-section, and I just realized I forgot to mention Seth, their 3rd child. They had a 3rd child, and then they decided to have a 4th child. Leah was born a month early via emergency C-section, and Tammy nearly died. Chad admits the doctors told them not to have any more kids, but he knew they were supposed to have 5 because that's how many there were in his vision. It sounds like Chad hadn't been back to digging graves for very long when he decided to start writing fiction. One day he was shoveling snow in the graveyard when, from out of nowhere came a voice that said, "It's time to write your books." This came as a complete surprise to me. I'd written some family histories and had the desire to write a novel, but I'd never been able to come up with a plot for a book. I leaned on the shovel and said aloud, "That's great, but I have no idea what to write about." Almost immediately, the entire plot of my first novel, An Errand for Emma, came to me. This part I actually believe. I've had entire plots spring to mind, especially when doing mundane tasks like shoveling. This part I find less credible. I jotted down a short summary during my lunch break. Then I worked on the book at night for the next few weeks. I submitted the manuscript to Cedar Fort Publishing, and I was offered a publishing contract. To my surprise, the novel became a regional bestseller, and I got a lot of publicity in the newspapers about the gravedigger who wrote a book. Something about this is odd. It's all so casual. He jotted down the plot on his lunch break and then fiddled with it for a couple of weeks, and then suddenly he's a regional bestseller? I'm not sure why he's downplaying this process. Even short novels put out by small publishing companies require a lot of work. I think he's trying to emphasize how easily success came to him. Maybe. I'm not completely sure. This chapter also includes the section I read in my Escape to Zion book about Chad claiming to have had a dream about 9/11, which I won't read again because it's offensive and stupid. We all know Chad didn't predict 9/11. Now I want to talk about a section I haven't heard anyone else discuss, but that I find fascinating. I was confident that my books were inspired from a heavenly source, and I knew that writing them was helping fulfill my promise to Grandpa Keith. But it always helps when the dark side reinforces that you are on the right track. One night, as I was falling asleep, I heard a rustling noise outside our bedroom window. As I lay there, a dozen voices suddenly shouted in unison, "We hate your books!" It was fairly loud, and I looked over at Tammy, but she was asleep. Then they repeated the phrase. I jumped up and looked out the window, but no one was there. The voices were high-pitched and certainly not mortal. I knew I'd been visited by evil spirits. It's possible that Chad made this up out of whole cloth and none of it ever happened. But I also wonder if it did. Could some neighborhood kids have hidden under his window and shouted that they hated his books, and Chad interpreted it as evil spirits? I think that by this time, Chad was already living in his imagination to the point that he was capable of interpreting real events through the lens of his so-called psychic abilities. In fact, that was probably exciting for him. It probably felt like his spiritual life was becoming less nebulous and more literally real. Chad says he rededicated the house to God and didn't have any more trouble. The encounter actually strengthened me to know that the adversary wasn't pleased with the books I was writing. Their plan backfired on them, but no one has ever accused evil spirits of being too bright. So Chad feels that not only did God want his books to exist, but the books are so important that Satan has taken a personal interest in their author. He thinks the books are so holy that the forces of evil are amassing against him. It's not really that big a jump to calling them scripture if he feels that they've become important in the war between good and evil. Against all medical advice, he and Tammy decided to have another baby. As 1999 progressed, Tammy and I discussed whether to have a fifth child. I didn't press the issue, because the doctor had been so adamant that Tammy's life would be at risk if she became pregnant again. But Tammy hadn't forgotten my vision of our children either. The phrase, "Don't forget about me," seemed to come up a lot in our daily lives. Given that we can assume he didn't really have a vision of all 5 children, I wonder what actually happened. The way he tries to put all the responsibility for the decision on Tammy's shoulders makes me wonder if the truth was the exact opposite. One possibility that I find disturbing is I wonder if Chad did tell Tammy he'd had a vision of them with 5 kids, and then he pressured her to get pregnant again in order to prove his vision correct. That's the problem with making the fulfillment of your visions dependent on someone else. Obviously, this is all wild speculation. I'm just curious about why they decided to have a 5th child against medical advice when they already had 4 healthy kids. Luckily, Tammy and baby Mark both came through with no complications. Thus ends chapter 15. Chapter 16. Choosing between 2 paths. Chad decided he needed a traditional 9-to-5 job. Weekend funerals were messing with his ability to hold book signings. He took a job with a computer products company selling laser printer cartridges. And he took the job so he could hold book signings, but then he says he put writing on the back burner to focus on work. This is one of those sections where I can't quite read between the lines, but I know there's something missing. He doesn't seem to have worked at the printer cartridge company for too long, though, because one afternoon I received a call from the owner of Cedar Fort. He told me he needed a managing editor. I had done some freelance editing work for them the previous year, and they were pleased that my books were selling well. He offered me the position, saying I would be a great fit with the other employees. I can't quite believe that anyone thought Chad Daybell would make a good editor, but someone apparently did. He was excited by the offer, but the salary was $10,000 less than he was making selling printer cartridges. He told his current boss about the offer, and the boss counter-offered and said he'd raise Chad's salary $20,000 if he stayed. I flat out don't believe this story. That's a huge sum of money, and it would have been worth even more 20 years ago. And it sounds like Chad had only been with the company for a year or two. Also, Chad is super materialistic. If he'd gotten offered that kind of money, he would have taken it. The rest of the chapter is an explanation of the visions he had that led him to take the job and the pay cut. He claims to have seen two paths, the first of which promised he would be promoted to a top manager at the printer cartridge company and make a lot of money. I sensed I didn't progress too far spiritually, and neither did my family. I never had time to write additional books, and the lives of my children seemed to be hollow shells compared to what they could become. In the vision, I then retreated back to the starting point and took the path to the right. I saw financial challenges and many stressful situations, but I also saw a strong marriage and a unified family. Like many cult leaders, Chad used his so-called extrasensory abilities to justify doing what he wanted, but he actually explains quite clearly in the text why he really took the editor position. I had known since I was in the 4th grade that I would be a writer and an editor. That's what I had been trained to become at BYU and the Ogden Standard Examiner. He wanted to. That's the explanation. That's always the explanation. Thus ends chapter 16. Chapter 17, Joining Cedar Fort. Chad brags about working directly under Lee Nelson, who's a famous LDS author. Lee edited all of the Beyond the Veil books Chad read, which are collections of Mormon NDEs. Lee likes to brag about the fact that he once shot a buffalo with a bow and arrow while on horseback because he was researching a historical novel. I appreciate the commitment to historical accuracy, but was it really necessary to kill a buffalo? It was during this period that Chad wrote several nonfiction books. The Youth of Zion and the Aaronic Priesthood are both religious instruction for young people. I don't know who the LDS Top 5 lists was written for. It's the kind of book you used to find in someone's bathroom, something you can pick up and read for 5 minutes and it won't matter if you didn't start where you left off last time because there's no narrative. I will do a video on these at some point. An author named David Ridges had written a book called Isaiah Made Easier that broke down the book of Isaiah verse by verse, and Chad liked it. And one day he told Mr. Ridges that he should write more books like that one, and Cedar Fort ended up publishing a very successful series with him. Chad acts like this never would have happened without the spirit prompting him to approach Mrs. Ridges in the grocery store and say, "Tell Dave to write more books." As an aside, please don't approach my partner in the grocery store and ask him to bug me about writing more books. I don't know how involved Chad was in the germination of this idea, but it certainly wouldn't be unusual for a publisher to approach an author they'd previously worked with, who already had a huge platform and a successful book in the community, and who was about to retire from teaching, and ask them to write another book. That wasn't inspired on Chad's part, it was just Chad doing his job. Chad ends the chapter with a story about how he and Tammy did a bunch of her ancestors' temple work. He claims that a relative they overlooked and then discovered visited Tammy's grandmother, Lucille, in spirit form, and that's why he named Tina's grandmother in Chasing Paradise Lucille Marlar, which doesn't really explain anything. Thus ends chapter 17. Chapter 18, Spring Creek Books. Suddenly, Chad was burned out on the publishing business, so God told him to start his own publishing business. Funny how the God in Chad's real life was starting to resemble the one in his stories, isn't it? What Chad is trying to cover up here is that there had been some drama at Cedar Fort. I don't have confirmation of this. I don't have any secret sources. I just have a Deseret News article and a bit of experience in the publishing industry. Chad published a book called Chasing Paradise with Cedar Fort, where he also worked, and a book buyer at Deseret Books objected to the content. Because of that, Deseret Books refused to stock it. The scene the book buyer objected to featured an angel drop-kicking a demon. I know that probably sounds pretty tame to many of us, but Deseret Books is the official bookstore of the LDS Church, and they only wanted to stock spiritually appropriate books. And they also mentioned that Chad's books for adults didn't sell. Anyway, Chad refused to change the scene, and while I'm guessing Deseret Books still wouldn't have stocked it even if he had, I'm also guessing this caused conflict for Chad at work. He torpedoed the book's sales potential. I don't know if he rage quit or if Cedar Fort fired him, but this story about getting burned out has a lot of holes. By early 2004, I had been on the publishing treadmill at Cedar Fort for 3 years. We continued to produce great books, and I loved working with Lee and Georgia, but I needed a mental break, and I didn't see one in sight. We were releasing so many titles each month that it felt like I had more deadlines to meet than I'd had working at the Standard Examiner. One evening, I left the office late, feeling like I was finally getting caught up. Then I returned in the morning, and Lee had put several more accepted manuscripts on my chair. I just kind of snapped. I went home and told Tammy I'd had enough. She certainly understood. I wrote a resignation letter and put it on the owner's desk. The line, "Tammy certainly understood," makes me suspicious. Why did Chad feel like he needed to include the word certainly here, to use an adverb as an intensifier? So God told Chad to start a publishing company, and he told Tammy, and Tammy said no, because Chad also told her she'd have to be the company's accountant. Did Tammy know anything about accounting? I've never heard anyone say that she did. Then Chad told her to pray about it, and he claims she got the strongest confirmation of her life in response. Maybe this happened. Maybe Chad got lucky. Or maybe Chad faked it. I'm not saying he did. I don't even know what that would look like. I mean, how do you convince someone they're getting a message from God? I thought the idea that Chad could have manipulated Tammy like this was far-fetched. But then I remembered something I did. This was in my early 20s. One night, my dad and I were drinking Manhattans and watching boxing, and the regular match finished, and they announced they were going to show a historical match. I think it was Joe Louis versus Rocky Marciano. Anyway, Dad got up to go to the kitchen just as they were saying this, and he was out of the room when they gave a little history, and when they spoiled the ending of the fight. So the fight started and Dad walked back in. Well, I was a little tipsy, and I had an idea. I said, Dad, I think I'm having a psychic premonition. I know how the fight's going to end. I need a piece of paper. So I grabbed a notepad and I wrote, Marciano knocks Louis through the effing ropes. Then I folded it up and I gave it to Dad to hold, and he put it under his drink coaster. So in the 8th round...
Another left crumples Louis, a blazing right, and Louis sails through the ropes.
And I said, look at the note, Dad. He opened it up. He read it to himself. And I watched his body get still as he stopped breathing. And I watched the color start to drain out of his face. And it lasted about 3 seconds before he figured out what was going on. But for those 3 seconds, I had him. So I don't know how Chad could have convinced Tammy that God wanted her to help him open a publishing house. But maybe he found a way. Or maybe Chad just got lucky that time. Chad also says that the Spirit told him that if he started the publishing company, his family would be better off financially in 5 years than they were then. God's given up texting, now he's emailing financial projections. To his credit, Chad does seem to have had a business model in mind for Spring Creek Books. He was going to contact LDS celebrities and convince them to write books, and he would publish them. I have to admit, I've heard far worse business models. But then I watched a lot of CoffeeZilla during the pandemic. Chad managed to convince a former Miss Utah, an American Idol finalist, and a college football star to write and publish books with him. He also says that Spring Creek won Small Wholesaler of the Year at the LDS Bookseller Convention in 2005 and 2006, and I can only assume that the vast majority of the credit for that should go to Tammy and her mother, Phyllis, who was the company's sales director. So Tammy did the finances, she did all the cover designs, and she did at least some of the editing. And Phyllis did all the sales and working with bookstores. What did Chad do? Was he president of Celebrity Outreach? Although he doesn't mention them, he wrote several other books during this time period, books that probably didn't sell well based on how hard they were to find. I had to order one of them from England. These include a picture book about John the Apostle, a book for children who are getting baptized, and a choose-your-own-adventure style book for kids about the restoration of the church in 1830. I'm working on a video on these titled Lesser-Known Garbage. Too harsh? Chad also dipped his toe into the NDE publishing space for the first time. As I said earlier, I'm confident he was well aware of the success of Embraced by the Light, and that's probably why he published the near-death experience memoir of one Suzanne Freeman. I know many of you are hidden true crime fans, as am I, so you might have seen Lauren's very good interview with Suzanne. Interestingly, Suzanne is a member of that very small club of people who called Chad out. Not long before the children were reported missing, Suzanne told Chad that he'd changed and wasn't moving in a godly direction, and she wanted her book rights back, and he told her he'd get back to her and then never did. Back in 2004, Chad heard about Suzanne's NDE through a mutual friend and decided to meet her. She gave me a brief synopsis of her near-death experience. Then I asked her if she'd read other near-death accounts, wondering if she had borrowed some ideas from those stories. Classic projection. Classic. I recently read Suzanne's first two books, and they're certainly much better written than anything of Chad's, although she did have a ghostwriter. As near-death experience memoirs go, I would say they're quite good. And it looks to me like Chad ripped off a lot of her ideas, especially from her second book, for his Standing in Holy Places series. Unsurprisingly, Chad devotes the rest of the chapter to discussing the Standing in Holy Places series. As I said in my last video, these stories are less told in order than they are stream of consciousness, and I'm not surprised that he went from talking about an author he ripped off to directly discussing the stories in which he used the stolen ideas. He claims he had a series of visions of the future and knew he needed to include them in the new series. As I worked on the novel, I would have glimpses of the Oval Office, but I would only see the back of the U.S. President's chair. I never saw his face, but I heard his speaking cadence and the phrases he used. It certainly wasn't President George W. Bush. I knew I was writing about a future U.S. president. You never saw his face? How convenient for your career as a fake psychic. I don't think Chad intended to throw shade, but the fact that he says he knew the man wasn't Bush because of his speaking cadence and the phrases he used tickled me. How I miss the days of Bush's speaking gaffes. Chad wrote the first book in the Standing in Holy Places series, but he struggled to describe the invasion of the U.S. by the coalition troops. Probably because Chad has zero understanding of the military and geopolitics. But don't worry, it was all meant to be. Dad helped edit the novel, and he pointed out that it seemed like I really rushed through that part. We talked about expanding it, but that night the spirit told me, "That's enough for now. A time will come when you can write about it with greater clarity." I had no idea what that answer meant, but it has been fulfilled in my new Times of Turmoil series. The new series is, in itself, the fulfillment of a prophecy. It feels like he's trying to head off criticism again here. It's not his fault that the invasion was barely described and that the coalition's attempt to save bullets by wiping out Americans with swords made no logical sense. That's what the visions showed. You can't blame Chad for the content of his fake visions. Thus ends chapter 18. Chapter 19, Company Collapse. Now, according to the book The Doomsday Mother, Spring Creek Books only averaged about $4,000 in profit annually. I don't know where those numbers came from or if they're accurate. I thought that the insurance broker at Chad's trial said he'd made $30,000 from the publishing company the year before Tammy died. But I could be misremembering, or that might have been income before expenses if Chad was running it as a sole proprietorship. I don't know. Either way, by 2008, the company was bankrupt, and Chad and Tammy were more than $200,000 in debt. Chad blames this entirely on the Great Recession, which I'm sure didn't help, but based on those numbers, the company would have folded without the recession. I realized it had been 4.5 years since the spirit had told me my family would be better off in 5 years. I was admittedly bitter, because the chance of that prompting coming true looked very unlikely. In order to get their heads above water again, they declared bankruptcy. Tammy took a job teaching in the computer lab at an elementary school, and Chad became the Spanish Fork cemetery sexton. The starting salary was a pleasant surprise. I would be paid better than I ever had, with great insurance. Really? I looked into this, and I discovered that Utah pays its cemetery sextons considerably more than the national average, so maybe it's true that their income was higher than ever before. When I started the Spanish Fork cemetery job, the promise of the spirit had been fulfilled almost 5 years to the day. With our 2 new jobs, we were indeed better off financially than we were in February 2004. The implication is that all of this was meant to be, that Chad and Tammy had to start the publishing company and it had to fail in order for Chad to get this new job and for them to have more money than ever before. But presumably all of their savings were wiped out, plus their credit was trashed in the bankruptcy, so it seems like a stretch to say they were better off than ever before. I know the Lord works in mysterious ways, but this is too much, especially when you read about the effect it had on Tammy. The company's collapse had really taken a toll on Tammy. She was our chief financial officer and took the brunt of the financial stress. She didn't smile for a long time, and she showed the symptoms of having suffered a mental breakdown. It was definitely the most challenging phase of our marriage. This is just heartbreaking, especially the part where Chad implies that Tammy's struggles with her mental health made her a bad wife, which I assume is what that last line is meant to imply. Chad says he gave her a priesthood blessing that strengthened them both, during which he had a vision, yada yada yada. The truth is that Tammy ended up on antidepressants and stayed on them until her death a decade later. And I'm glad she got treatment and support. I just wish Chad hadn't co-opted her story to hype himself up as a psychic again. Thus ends Chapter 19. Chapter 20, Spanish Fork Cemetery. Chad tells several more ghost stories in this chapter. They're, again, similar to the ones in One Foot in the Grave, by which I mean they aren't at all remarkable. He tells one story about a friend of his who fell into a depression after the death of his wife from cancer, but then began hearing her voice when he visited the cemetery. Then one day while at Karen's grave, Dawn heard her voice. She told him she was doing fine and that he needed to get back to living a normal life again. She said his grief was actually affecting her ability to work in the spirit world, and she had received permission to speak to him. How nice of Karen to tell Don to get on with his grief and, stop feeling bad. That doesn't sound like Chad at all. A week later, Don told Chad that Karen recommended a book Chad wrote called Chasing Paradise. That's right. Chad's books were so spiritually important that actual spirits were recommending them. I brought him the book the next day, and he returned it a few days later. "Thank you," Don said. "I read it twice. Your book makes everything so much clearer." Chad is obsessed with people in the spirit world having these incredibly important missions. But when he actually describes the missions, they all sound like unpaid internships. Karen had explained to him that she helped schedule classes for people who had accepted the gospel in spirit prison. She told Don that she arranges the seating in massive classrooms. Her afterlife job is arranging seating? This woman was a good Christian all her life, and this is her reward? The next section switches topics. Some of my most powerful visions have occurred when I was operating a weed eater to trim around headstones. I suppose it was because my mind was basically unoccupied and could be filled with heavenly knowledge. I had a thought the other day that the reason Chad kept going back to cemetery work, even though he hated the physical exertion of it, is that the repetitive nature of manual labor allowed him to focus entirely on his inner fantasy life. Chad very much lives in his head, very much in his fantasies, and that's probably true of most writers. We're often attracted to activities like long walks, gardening, handcrafts that allow us to stay busy while we ruminate on our stories. I've done a lot of my best plotting while driving or quilting, so I'm not surprised that Chad was off in his mind while weed whacking. What I do think is important, though, is to notice the way Chad draws a parallel between the stories produced by his imagination and his religious visions. Earlier in the book, he talked about how he suddenly created the entire plot of his first novel while doing lawn care in the cemetery. Now he says that because his mind was unoccupied, it could be filled with heavenly knowledge. He's equating his fantasies with spiritual inspiration. Then he writes a line that seems to reference the introduction and reassure any church leaders reading that he isn't going to spread his pearls among swine. Many of these visions were sacred and aren't appropriate to include in this book. God decided that mid-weed whacking was the right time for a sacred experience. But it turns out that was just a teaser. Many of these visions are incorporated in the final 2 volumes of my Standing in Holy Places series, though. It blows my mind that he was shamelessly promoting his books like this, and people still thought he was sincere in his spirituality. The chapter ends with a list of positions Chad has held in the church. I've heard that Chad was annoyed that he was never called as a bishop, but I think the church made the right decision on that one. Can you imagine the mayhem he could have sown if he was put in a position of actual authority? Thus ends chapter 20. Chapter 21, Lucille gets feisty. This chapter is probably the most disturbing in the book because it covers a particularly upsetting manipulation of Tammy by Chad. First, Chad explains that during this time, he felt strongly that he and Tammy needed to be focused on doing the genealogy and temple work for her Marlar ancestors. However, Tammy struggled to get motivated about it. She'd found a new hobby, Frontierville, a spin-off of the online computer game Farmville. She was spending a few hours each day building fictional online towns. I was hoping she would soon get bored with it. I went to the temple and received a strong impression to tell Tammy she needed to stop playing Frontierville cold turkey. I did as I had been prompted, and we had a good discussion about it. Tammy knew the game had become an addiction, but she didn't fully stop. She didn't resume working on family history either. Chad really hates video games. He'd started railing against them in his books before this, but it ramped up around this time. Other than sports and square dancing, he seems to think that most recreation is a waste of time. I'm not even going to try to justify Tammy playing this game because it needs no justification. When Chad's first manipulation didn't work, he escalated and tried again. This time he claimed that Tammy's grandmother, Lucille, appeared to him and told him that thousands of Tammy's ancestors were stuck in spirit prison until their temple work got done. She said, "My descendants are letting Satan lull them to sleep with technology. 2 months ago in the temple, I told you to have Tammy quit her damn computer game cold turkey so she would be receptive to a message from me, but she didn't. She has more important work to do than play games. We need her desperately." This is the only time I think I've ever heard Chad curse. I don't even know if he cared about the video game at this point. I think he was just angry that he couldn't control Tammy, and his anger resulted in this escalation of manipulation. He claims that it worked and that Tammy submitted thousands of her ancestors' names to the temple, but we know she was secretly playing video games until her death. It makes me happy that she found a way to defy Chad. Thus ends chapter 21. Chapter 22, recent spiritual books. In November of 2012, Visions of Glory was published. For those of you visiting from the Dagobah system, Visions of Glory is a near-death experience memoir about a man's visions of the end times. It's sold over 100,000 copies now, despite having a pretty disturbed subtext. The book has been huge in the Mormon community, and although the LDS Church has privately criticized the author for writing it, they haven't made a formal statement against it. We know that Chad read this book. At the trial, we heard a jailhouse call in which he read a passage to Lori. He definitely would have been aware of the success of Visions of Glory. Although Spring Creek Books had collapsed financially, it still existed, and Chad continued to sell the company's existing titles while he worked in the cemetery. While Chad was still interested in writing books with celebrities, I think he saw the success of Visions of Glory and realized he had been promoting the wrong kind of celebrities. He needed spiritual celebrities, and he started looking for them online. He claims to have had a vision of a dark-haired woman with a distinctive voice who would bring him a near-death experience memoir to publish. In January 2014, I was checking a preparedness website when I saw a post by a woman named Julie Rowe, who said she felt she should share her near-death experience. She asked if anyone knew someone who might be able to help publish her experience. I thought, I do. Presumably, the website he references here was Avow. I'm not going to rag too much on Julie Rowe, because it's apparent that a lot of her behavior stems from untreated or undertreated mental illness. That said, many people have raised questions about the legitimacy of her end times charity. A lot of people have suggested that Chad and Julie were having an affair. Julie has also claimed that Chad SA'd her, and that he murdered her in a past life. I'm not sure what to make of that last one. What I will say is that Chad very much downplays Julie's role in his life, suggesting she was just another author when it's obvious that, whatever the exact nature of their relationship, they were very close. He does take a moment to try to defend her, though, and I think he's defending her against the church. Julie is a humble, kind person who simply seeks to do the Lord's will. The books have blessed many lives in helping people recognize and understand the Lord's love for each of us. She has received severe opposition at times, but I see that as a testament that she's on the right course and is spreading a message of truth. I appreciate her courage and faithfulness. There's that word humble again. It's not a word I associate with Chad or Julie. Julie was excommunicated by the LDS Church in April of 2019, by the way. Lauren Mathias reports that at some point, Julie Rowe and Chad Daybell began meeting in person with Tom Harrison, the man whose story was told in Visions of Glory. Exactly what they were meeting about isn't known, but I figure the end of the world probably came up pretty often. As I mentioned before, I'm eventually going to do a video on Visions of Glory, so if you know of any books that Tom Harrison might have ripped off or been influenced by, please drop me a line at wordwisevideos@gmail.com. Julie's NDE memoir was a big hit, and my impression is that it single-handedly revived Spring Creek Books. I don't understand why it was a big hit. It's not good. Like, half of it is just Julie retelling biblical stories with added details. The other half was ripped off from Visions of Glory. The details around the near-death experience were also suspicious, and the rumor I've heard is that they didn't add up because she didn't have an NDE. She actually had a psychotic break. While I feel for her if that's the case, I don't approve of her relabeling that experience to take advantage of the popularity of NDE memoirs. One reviewer agreed. Julie mentioned that her experience was sacred and she could not share it, but yet wrote a book about it. If Julie cannot share her experience because it is too sacred, which I respect, then make it a secret and take it to the grave. Definitely don't write about NDEs and title the book NDE and then give scriptures quotes and a testimony but no NDE at all. This one I just thought was funny. Rowe is one of the worst authors, seers, economist, food storage experts, visionary, fraud, camper, stock expert, historian in existence. The popularity of Julie's books probably inspired Chad to publish similar stories. He next claims that after he read some visions posted on a website by Hector Sosa, the spirit instructed him to go to Hector's house and tell him he needed to write a book. So Chad did. Hector's book isn't technically an NDE memoir. He claims to have had visions all his life, but his visions are remarkably similar to the narrative in Standing in Holy Places, and the one in Julie Rowe's book, and the one in Visions of Glory. It's all Mormons hiding in the mountains and plagues and foreign invasions. Do I think these similarities are a coincidence? Absolutely not. Chad, Julie, and Hector were all part of this avow preparing a people doomsday crowd. So were Melanie Gibb and David Warwick and Jason Mao. They were all making money by peddling similar premonitions of the apocalypse. Chad couldn't resist the lure of celebrity, though. He contacted a former high school friend turned NFL quarterback, Scott Mitchell. Scott had gained a lot of weight after he left the NFL, and eventually he participated in a season of The Biggest Loser. And it was at that point that Chad contacted him about writing a book together, which they did. Chad says that running the publishing company and working in the cemetery got to be too much for him, and that his psychic abilities made working in a graveyard unbearable. So in 2014 he quit and went to work for his brother-in-law, Jason Gwilliam's window installation company. He says he'll never go back to cemetery work. That's the one prediction he made that will probably come true. Thus ends chapter 22. Chapter 23, An Unexpected Move to Idaho. Most of this chapter is taken up by the story of how the spirit told Chad to move to Idaho, and Tammy reluctantly agreed. Chad said she prayed about it and got a confirmation after several weeks. What he doesn't say is that he moved to Rexburg in spite of his brother and sister-in-law asking him not to, and that he probably bought a house down the street from them in order to spite his sister-in-law. What he doesn't say is that he manipulated his son Garth into moving there too by claiming Garth's apartment in Utah was haunted. What he doesn't say is that Tammy had to work full-time while Chad farted around writing his last series, The Conspiracy Theory-Laden Times of Turmoil. Thus ends chapter 23. Chapter 24, Looking to the Future. This chapter seems to be a roundup of things Chad didn't find another place to discuss. He claims to have seen a vision that told him Geneva Steel would go out of business, and another that promised the area would be rocked by a massive earthquake. Julie Rowe and Tom Harrison also talk about earthquakes that will destroy much of Salt Lake City. Unlike Tom Harrison, Julie and Chad are foolish enough to give dates for these predictions. Then Chad abruptly jumps to talking about his writing process. I've read this before, but I'll read it again because it's just so silly. I don't fictionalize any of the events portrayed. I'm really not that creative. Let me describe how my writing process occurs. My torn veil allows information to be downloaded into my brain from the other side. The scenes I am shown are real events that will happen, but it is my job to fit them into the lives of the fictional families in my novels. He says he insists on writing in a priesthood-dedicated space, which I don't entirely understand because he holds the priesthood, so can't he just pick a place and then dedicate it himself? He includes a bit about the actual act of writing. When I'm able to write without interruption, I can write up to 10 pages in 2 or 3 hours. As I pray and focus on a particular chapter, scenes open up to me. I simply type into my laptop what I'm seeing. It is like watching a snippet of a movie, and once I get the details of that snippet typed in, another scene is placed in my mind. As a writer, this is interesting to me. The writing community often jokes that there are 2 types of writers, planners and pantsers. Planners plan their stories out before they begin writing. Pantsers write by the seat of their pants. Some people do a bit of both, but many of us find that this is an area where we really have to honor whichever process our brain decides is right for us. It's kind of like being a morning person or a night person. Science says either is fine, health-wise, as long as you embrace the schedule your body wants. I'm a night owl. I'm also a pantser. And the biggest mistake I ever made with my writing was spending years trying to become a planner, because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. What Chad's description of his writing process tells us is that he's also a pantser. Now, the thing about being a pantser is you have to put a lot of time into editing. Planners work out plot issues in advance, but pantsers have to write something and then revise to get the plot straightened out. Unfortunately, Chad never learned this. It explains a lot of why his books are so dreadful. They're basically first drafts. He explains that his novels about the end of days are based on visions he had of his children's lives during those times. However, putting two and two together, it means in my Standing in Holy Places series that fictional Emma's father, Mark Dalton, is loosely based on my own future. I have seen myself in vision as an older man having the wonderful opportunity of helping build New Jerusalem. I appeared to be in better shape in the future than I am now, probably due to the lack of fast food restaurants in Zion. But Chad, if there are no fast food restaurants in Zion, how will you ever find your way around? No, but really, this irritated me, because Chad isn't Mark Dalton, and he knows it. He's Doug. It's obvious he's Doug. I don't know why he wants people to think he's Mark. The last section is a brief scene of Chad imagining all his ancestors climbing out of their graves. I realized that achieving salvation is a great team effort that is happening on both sides of the veil. When that glorious day arrives when we earn our reward, we will share it with those we love. I'm looking forward to it. Thus ends Living on the Edge of Heaven. I normally end by talking about how the book could be improved and what we've learned about Chad from it. But today I want to skip straight to talking about Chad because I don't know how to fix a nonfiction book based on lies. It's only in the last month that I've started to feel like I really understand who Chad is and how he operates. And everything I'm going to say now is speculation. This is all just how I've made sense of things in my mind. It may or may not be true. You'll have to judge for yourself. I think I mentioned once before that Chad got the rights to the Emma trilogy back and published altered second editions of all of them. And when I began looking at the changes he made, it was clear that he'd majorly revised the timeline of the future in Escape to Zion. Well, here's my second revelation. I think he made those particular revisions in order to bring the story's timeline into alignment with the one in Visions of Glory. I think he saw the success of that book and he wanted it. So he got in touch with Tom Harrison and said, I've been seeing the same things. He wanted people who talked about Visions of Glory to end their conversations with, and all the things he predicted are the same things this other guy has been saying. His name is Chad Daybell. All of these cult leaders are scam artists. If Chad hadn't been stopped, how many more of these NDE doomsday preppers could he and Julie and Tom and Hector have gotten to join forces and start predicting the same thing? He got Mike and Nancy James from Preparing a People to move to Rexburg. He got Zulema Pastenis and Alex Cox. He was working on David Warwick and Melanie Gibb. I think that Chad wanted to take his scam and his cult corporate. Now, I'm not suggesting Chad was conscious of this as a plan. I don't think he's smart enough to even conceive of such a thing. My guess is that Chad operates largely on a predatory instinct to protect his incredibly fragile ego. And I don't claim to know exactly what the nature of this larger scam was. At its simplest, it might have just been to boost each other's sales, which I wouldn't consider a scam at all if these books hadn't been based on lies. But there's a lot we don't know about Chad and Lori's plans. Were they going to take Charles's life insurance money and invest in a company that sold prepper supplies? Chad and Julie were reported to have gone out to survey land on more than one occasion, and he was trying to get David Warwick to buy some. Why? What were they going to do with that land? Was it related to Julie's claims that she was preparing places of refuge? Chad had Mike and Nancy under his thumb. What if conferences were just the beginning? There are more ways to monetize people's fear than you can shake a stick at. And the one thing I know for certain is that Chad and Lori's plan wasn't supposed to end with them in prison. It was supposed to end with the two of them being fawned over by Jesus in the celestial kingdom. And if they made a little money along the way, so much the better. But there's another reason Chad edited Escape to Zion to make its timeline resemble the one in Visions of Glory. Because he steals stuff from other writers. That's what he does. He stole the entire Standing in Holy Places series from Suzanne Freeman and the books of prophecies about the end times that he read. He stole the characters for it from his other series, even though it was set in a different universe. He steals his characters' names from people he knows. He steals his plot lines from his own ancestors. He saw a book with a better plot line than his own, so he stole it and incorporated it into his second editions. But it wasn't until I realized why he really started Spring Creek Books that it all began to click for me. He didn't start the book company because God told him to. He started it because he wanted complete control over his publishing career, without having to appease his editor or his publisher or Deseret Books. And he did it to get back at his boss, who had probably asked him to change the book. I thought, if he completely left that out of his autobiography, if he skipped over the entire controversy surrounding Chasing Paradise and instead made up this weird story about being burnt out, what else did he lie about? It's like he's retconning his own life. Oh. He's retconning his own life. That's how he was able to believe all of this was real. Chad is so invested in fantasy, and living in fantasy has become so ingrained in his way of functioning, that he's able to revise his own beliefs and interpretations, and even his own past, to a degree most of us couldn't fathom. I'm not suggesting he's psychotic. I don't think this has anything to do with psychosis. I think he's completely in touch with reality. He just doesn't like it. So he chooses to ignore it and instead focus on these elaborate fantasies. And why wouldn't he? He's made himself a translated being with a wife who's a goddess. Who wouldn't prefer that over being a lower middle class cemetery sexton who's bored with his marriage? He just lacks the moral center to realize that hurting other people for the sake of his fantasy life is unacceptable. I keep thinking about Chad's account of the bee incident, that the voice shouted at him. Why did it have to shout before Chad could hear it? If that was his conscience, why did it have to shout to the point that he thought it was coming from outside his head before he would stop and listen to it? Was it because Chad was off in his fantasy of being Moroni with a thirst for honey and a pair of Reeboks? If you ignore your conscience to the point that it ceases to exist, what's left? Our consciences are what teach us that other people are as real as we are. It's what allows us to connect to other people. It's the voice of our empathy and our immutable connection to each other. You can't ignore that voice until you no longer feel empathy and expect that society isn't going to come down on you hard. And it came down on Chad hard. The reason Chad can't create anything, the reason he has to steal from other writers, is that there's nothing in him to create from. He's shut off his humanity. There's no one in there. Chad Daybell doesn't exist. He is, for all practical purposes, a zombie. And the reason he wanted to kill people was because doing so reinforced to him that all of this was real. He had been testing whether or not he could trust the belief that he was special his entire life. I'm sure it started small. First, he got his patriarchal blessing early. That meant he was special. Then he turned in his mission papers early, and they were accepted. That meant he was special. Every time he took a little step and trusted that he could make the fantasy of being special real, he was rewarded. The bigger the lies he told, the more he was rewarded. Yeah, I've had a near-death experience. I've had two. Of course I'll speak at your conference. And the more bored Chad was by the things he had to do to earn respect in the outside world, like working, the more he demanded respect in his fantasies. He wasn't really a cemetery sexton. He was a visionary. He was chosen by God to lead the 144,000. He was a prophet. Everyone was going to find out when the last days arrived. They would see that he was right. It was all real. And he killed people to prove that to himself. Because who in their right mind would do the worst thing a person can do to another human being if it was all just a game of pretend? I don't know if any of that rang true to anyone else. Everybody has to make sense of this tragedy for themselves and in their own way. This is how I've made sense of it and how I've come to understand it. You know, one day not too long ago, my mother asked me what I was going to do when I finished talking about Chad's books, and my father piped up, "Get a psych eval!" What's funny is the extent to which understanding Chad has made me feel sane. Like, I'm also a fantasy-prone person. Most writers probably are. But I'm not fantasy-prone like Chad is fantasy-prone. No. I'm gonna be okay. And it is my sincere hope that something in the 20-plus hours of talking about his work that I've posted has helped you feel okay too. And it's alright if it hasn't, and if you aren't okay yet. Let's all say a prayer or think a good thought for each other tonight, okay? If you made it to the end of this video, I am so grateful. If you'd like to join me again next time as I continue this plunge tank deep dive into the literary canon of serial killer and actual zombie Chad Daybell, please consider liking or subscribing. As a reminder, please don't reach out to anyone associated with this case who hasn't indicated they want to be contacted. And remember to use your words and your fantasies wisely. Good night.